The U.S. resumes talks with Iran. A potential deal could see Iran free U.S. prisoners in exchange for billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets. But will we see any actual outcome to these talks or another failed negotiation? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is U.S.-Iran talks. Well, after numerous attempts to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, U.S. and Iranian officials seem to be trying again, this time speaking behind closed doors. It's a step up from the indirect talks held last month in Oman, but any word of tangible progress has yet to emerge. Still, it's hoped these meetings could lead to some kind of informal or short-term agreement. The U.S. government has denied there is any deal being negotiated, but they have made it clear what they would like to see happen.
We continue to use diplomatic engagements to pursue all of these goals in full coordination with our allies and partners. But as I said yesterday, with respect to Iran's nuclear program, there is no deal. We have been clear what our Iran policy is and what our Iran objectives are. Number one, we want Iran to take steps to de-escalate tensions, which of course includes steps to curb its nuclear program. Number two, we want Iran to cease its actions that destabilize the region, including its support for proxy groups that carry out attacks. Number three, we want Iran to stop its support for Russia's war on Ukraine. Number four, we believe that Iran should release Americans who it continues to wrongfully detain. The wrongful detention of U.S. nationals and political leverage for political leverage is unacceptable, and we will continue to work to bring every American who is wrongfully detained home.
Well, Iran, on the other hand, has confirmed indirect talks with the U.S. in Oman, but has also ruled out negotiating any firm deal. For Iran, a potential agreement could prevent tensions around the now defunct nuclear deal from boiling over. In return, Iran would expect the U.S. to unfreeze billions of dollars in assets frozen abroad. But Iran's supreme leader has made it clear that any discussion concerning Tehran's nuclear program would only be possible if the country's nuclear infrastructure remains intact.
We do not want to go towards nuclear weapons based on Islam. If we wanted to go, they could not stop us, as they have been unable to stop our nuclear developments until now, and will not be able to stop them. You may not want to come to agreement in some areas. There is no problem, make an agreement, but the infrastructure must be maintained.
Well, for both sides on these renewed efforts, the stakes are high. For the U.S., these talks come ahead of the 2024 presidential election and will face scrutiny from U.S. lawmakers, as well as the key U.S. ally in the Middle East, Israel. According to reports, the U.S. has assured Israel that it will maintain its security and freedom to act against Iran.
Our position is clear. No agreement with Iran will be binding on Israel, which will continue to do everything to defend itself. Our opposition to a return to the original agreement, I think it is working, but there are still differences of outlook, and we do not hide them, also about smaller agreements. We enunciate our policy clearly both openly and in closed rooms.
So, will these closed-door talks yield real results? And if so, on which issues? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are, from Washington, David Jonas. He is the former general counsel of the National Nuclear Security Administration and a law lecturer at George Washington University. From Tehran is Foad Izadi. He is a professor of political communications at the University of Tehran and the author of United States Public Diplomacy Toward Iran. And also from Washington is John Erath. He is the senior policy director for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Thanks all so much for being with us. John, I'll start with you. What do you make of the fact that they are talking, be it behind closed doors or indirectly? Does it matter at this point, and to what end?
It's always a good sign that there is talk going on. This is, unfortunately, a song that we have heard before. There have been a number of rounds of talks. Everybody knows what the basic outlines of an arrangement would be. Sanctions relief in return for a resumption of compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So what we will see this time is if there is some serious approach to making progress through reaching a deal on that basis. I don't know what has changed. If it has, we can perhaps finally get a deal. But if it's like the previous rounds, then we will see that in the end, Tehran walks away from it.
Yeah, I mean, to hear you say you don't know what has changed can give one the impression that, we're just going over the same territory again and again, because it has been many months that we've been talking about renewed talks. It's been a bit of a pause this time, but yet here we are again. Let me turn to David, actually, because it was just 9 months ago, David Jonas, that we talked about attempts to revive the JCPOA. You'll remember the EU put forth that final text that apparently went nowhere. So here we are again. Is an informal deal maybe the best the Biden administration can actually do, especially with an election coming up?
Probably so. Of course, it's rather interesting and in a way humorous that when you consider that the JCPOA itself was a non-legally binding agreement. So in essence, it was a political agreement, or could also be termed an informal agreement, as a matter of, it's not binding under international law. So this informal agreement has to be even less than that, if that is imaginable, because, and there's some other reasons why it has to be less than that, because the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, or INARA, passed by Congress, requires the president to go to Congress and submit to Congress for 30 days any agreement pertaining to the Iran nuclear program. And so I think that what you're also seeing by calling this an informal agreement is an effort to evade somehow that need to go to Congress with this agreement by calling it an informal agreement or a mini agreement or other things we've heard.
Right. And then what about, not just evading the U.S. Congress, is there also a way to maybe not agitate Israel on a more severe level by making this less formal and doing these talks kind of behind closed doors?
Perhaps. Of course, we have to keep in mind that there is a U.S. presidential election coming up. And so meanwhile, the United States is working behind the scenes with Saudi Arabia to try to broker some kind of a deal there. So the Israeli view is certainly very important on this. And whether that is transmitted sub rosa or through open channels, Israel is going to have a say in this one way or another.
Fawad, what does Iran really hope to get out of this? The Supreme Leader has made it clear that its nuclear infrastructure will not change. So what is it about having assets unfrozen?
Iran hoped the Biden administration would return to the agreement on the first day of the Biden presidency. And he could do that. He could return to the agreement and give Iran 2 or 3 months to come back to compliance. When Trump left the agreement, he did so through an executive order. In the American system, the new president can nullify the previous president's executive orders. And Biden did that for the Paris Climate Accords and other difficulties that Trump created for U.S. foreign policy. And he could do that for the nuclear agreement. The reason he didn't do that is what your guest from Washington talked about. The problem was the U.S. Congress, not only just the Republicans, Democrats. Some of the Democrats also opposed the 2015 agreement. People like Robert Menendez, that was and is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. They didn't like the agreement. They didn't vote for it. He was opposed to it. He's still opposed to it. He openly criticizes the 2015 agreement. So that's one difficulty. The other difficulty is Israel and the Israel lobby. It's quite influential in Washington. And also even within the Biden administration, you had people leaving the administration on disagreements on the negotiations with Iran, people like Richard Nephew and others. So because of the chaos in Washington, the Biden administration did not return to the agreement. He could return to the agreement today. He cannot do that because of the upcoming elections and other internal difficulties that Biden has.
Okay.
So Iran is hoping and sort of waiting for the U.S. return to the agreement.
Okay. I mean, John, if we're realistic about it at this point in particular, it's, you know, not only do the conditions of 2015 no longer exist, to the point that people say it's just impossible to turn back to the original agreement, but it's gotten even worse at present, with now you even have Iran selling weapons to Russia, and the knowledge that Iran has gained in the nuclear space can't be taken back. So what could be part of the bargaining at this point?
The basic outlines of the deal have not really changed, and that is the return to the provisions of the JCPOA in return for sanctions relief. The important part of the JCPOA is the verification regime. The monitoring from the IAEA and international organizations that provide some confidence that there is not a actual weapons program going on. So this is something that could be resumed that would provide confidence and would provide the basis for further negotiations in the future. Just because that is so, it does not mean it is easy to do. This would require very careful negotiations, and it would require some compromise on both sides. But that's the way that international diplomacy works. It's never easy, but the rewards are usually there for those who have the patience.
David, let me ask if you agree there, because we've heard it argued now many times that since 2018, the progress that Iran has made with its nuclear program, there are some that argue, I mean, they could make a weapon tomorrow if they want to, with what they've been able to, as far as they've been able to enrich uranium and other technicalities that they've been able to improve on. Is there still some conditionality that could make what was signed in 2015 realistic now?
Well, John is right. I mean, there's always possibilities within diplomatic talks and in the diplomatic space, but when you look at one of the most important elements of the agreement, that Iran was not to exceed 3.67% of enrichment on uranium, and then we now understand that they're enriching to at least 60%, with some reports as high as 85 or 90%. That's very, very in the neighborhood of weapons grade uranium, to be sure. And of course, we don't know. And as I've always said, there's no, other than a nation testing its nuclear weapons, there's no announcement that happens when a nation actually achieves or puts together or assembles a nuclear weapon or manufactures one. Obviously, Iran has a legal obligation not to do so as a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT. But the problem is, and again, no disrespect to my colleague Fuad there, but it's not the Iranian people I don't trust. It's the Iranian government that repeatedly violates its own word on legally binding agreements, and not to mention non-legally binding agreements. It's very hard to trust them.
Fuad, how do you respond to that? Because you know there's this mistrust, that's quite obvious. And Iran... Okay, go ahead.
Response is quite obvious. You read the International Atomic Energy Agency reports. For the last many years, they have said that Iran has not had any diversion. That means that the uranium that's enriched in Iran is not used for military purposes. Even the U.S. intelligence community, the worldwide threat assessment that is presented to the U.S. Congress annually, has said for many years that Iran has not decided to militarize its nuclear program. Whether they will decide to do that or not, the U.S. intelligence community says they say they don't know, but Iran hasn't done that. Iran is the most inspected country in the world when it comes to its nuclear program. So demonizing Iran using terminology that they cannot be trusted does not fit, because Iran stayed in the nuclear agreement 1 year after Trump left the agreement. So if anybody should be mistrusted, it's the U.S. government. You know, when you have a new party, a new government, a new administration in Washington, that's just a party taking over the White House. It's not a coup.
Okay.
So it's the basic fact in international law that countries have to accept and follow the agreements that the previous administration made, and the U.S. doesn't follow that very basic international law.
Fuad, let's talk about what is actually on the table and at stake today. I mean, I brought up the fact that Iran is now selling weapons to Russia. That has angered the Americans. We know that Iran has proven time and time again that it can deal with sanctions, even maximum pressure. It can deal with internal instability. But does it want to? And how much might Iran be willing to compromise today on these new fronts in order to make some progress to get sanctions relief?
You know, with regard to selling of weapons to Russia, both Iran and Russia have denied it. I don't know. Maybe Iran is selling or maybe not selling. But it doesn't make sense to me that the Western governments can send billions of dollars worth of weapons to one side of a conflict, and Iran or other countries cannot supply weapons to another side of a conflict. So I don't understand that. If selling weapons or sending weapons is bad, why there is this double standards when it comes to that particular conflict.
Okay.
With regard to other issues, I think Iran has shown that Iran is willing and able to return to the agreement whenever Americans are ready to do so.
Okay. John, I mean, what is the minimum then that the U.S. wants here? Is it the release of prisoners? Which prisoners in particular? I mean, how much does this matter to Joe Biden politically to get something, anything out of these informal talks, even if it doesn't add up to a reinstatement or anywhere near that of the original nuclear deal?
It's not what it matters to Joe Biden. It is that it is the policy of the United States that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. And so what is important is the resumption of compliance with the JCPOA on the part of the Iranian government. How much that matters as far as the U.S. election, I'm a little bit skeptical that it would have a big impact. U.S. elections are typically decided on domestic economic issues more than anything that happens outside of the borders of the country. But it would certainly be a notable success for Biden were there to be a resumption of the Iran deal under the right conditions. And you touched on a number of these. Return of imprisoned American citizens would certainly be a big public success. So that would be something that would be important, but it's not something that is directly connected to the nuclear issue.
Let me put that to David, though. I mean, are there certain other underlying priorities here that the United States talking to Iran, just talking, not even about the JCPOA or the nuclear issue, there is a lot at stake between the U.S. and Iran. What are the other priorities at play here?
I think that to an extent, for what is correct, that if one country can sell weapons, another one can, but that doesn't mean that those kinds of things aren't negotiable within the broader context of this Iran deal. For instance, the United States has long had concerns with Iran's ballistic missile program and with its support for terrorism in the region. Those things, those details were not included for any number of reasons within the original JCPOA. But now that they're back at the table talking, those things become, once again, things that are proper for negotiation.
And what about the role, potentially, that Saudi and the GCC could be playing in here? I mean, when this was negotiated again in 2015, Saudi and Iran were not on good terms. Now there is a working relationship. So how is that factoring in?
That's an interesting question. I think that's a wild card that remains to be seen. I think that we don't know what is happening. I certainly don't know what is happening behind the scenes in talks with Iran and the Saudis now that they are back talking and have reestablished diplomatic relations. So that's a bit of a wild card. I'm not sure.
Fawad, is there anything your gut's telling you about what the interests of countries like Saudi Arabia and the other GCC countries, how their interests are being factored in now that there is a better relationship with Tehran and the Gulf?
I think we are moving towards a multipolar world. I think United States is a country in decline, and I think the princes in Saudi Arabia have realized this. That's why they're diversifying their security connections. They're increasing their relations with China. They're signing agreements with Iran in Beijing because they realize that the world is changing. And I hope American policymakers and intellectuals and think tankers realize the fact that the U.S. is not going to be a hegemon internationally. We are not going to be in a unipolar world anymore. And they need to realize that and engage in soft landing of the empire before it's too late. And continuing the policy of confrontation with Iran is not going to help them achieve that goal.
Interesting phrasing. John, what do you make of that? That the United States should be kind of considering a soft landing at this point because of the changing geopolitical dynamics in this multipolar world that we're living in now?
I've been hearing versions of that same song ever since I can remember, that the U.S. is in decline and we're now entering into a multipolar world. So this is, I think, more or less a permanent situation or a permanent perception in some quarters. But the point is still a good one, that it is important to consider the need for dialogue among countries. And so certainly it is welcome that Iran has a better relationship with some of its neighbors, that there is less possibility for a regional conflict in the Middle East. It is a welcome change if China is playing a constructive role internationally. That's still to be seen. I'm not convinced that it is, but if that were to be the case, it would certainly be a positive development. But in this case, as I started off by saying, it is always better to have talking than not talking. So the fact that the dialogue is going on is significant.
That's true, but I mean, David, Jonas, 9 months ago, Iran actually itself said that a deal was closer than ever. They were talking and they were talking, and we reported on it constantly. So what really happened? What's gone wrong since then?
It's tough to say, and the problem with international negotiations is that there's this concept that applies, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And that means that you can be at the finish line, literally a yard away, and somebody can go back to the very first negotiating point and reopen that. And that's the main thing that can make international negotiations so difficult, particularly in the legally binding area. But the Iran deal has its own peculiarities and problems that make it difficult. Those involve international perception, involves the relation between the two main parties. Of course, the United States pulled out, but the Iran deal, the other parties are still in. So it's in a curious position in that regard. And so you come up against all these problems when you try to fix this. And again, getting back to the original Iran nuclear deal is not going to happen. That is, nobody even thinks that's possible. And again, I agree with John. It's very good that they're talking. Talking is certainly better than fighting. And nobody wants a war between the U.S. and Iran. But yet this idea of Iran being in compliance with the JCPOA when they're at 60 to 80% enrichment, and that enrichment level has absolutely no application to any kind of a civilian program, is ludicrous. So Iran's...
Let me give Fuad the final minute for his response. Sure. Go ahead, Fuad.
As I said, Iran was following the nuclear agreement more than 1 year after Trump left. And the reason Iran is not in full compliance, the reason Iran is enriching at 60%, is that you cannot have a multilateral agreement and only one country, Iran, following it. If it's a multilateral agreement, all countries should be following it, and that's not what we are seeing. Iran is able to return to the agreement. So that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for Iran to have United States threatening to attack Iran militarily. They say all options are on the table. That means we can attack you militarily, which is against international law. You're not supposed to threat or use force against other countries unless you have a UN Security Council resolution. So every time you hear all options are on the table, that's a violation of international law. That's a violation of UN Charter.
Okay.
And at the same time, they say Iran should not have missiles to defend itself. So these are some of the difficulties that we continue to hear.
Foad, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.